Let's start adding some detail to the cliffs now. We'll return to the cliffs layer. We'll turn on preserve transparency, and we'll switch to the mountain knife. And what we want to do is we want to add some basic shape to these cliffs. It's going to be a kind of vertical shape. So we'll select our gray color and we will make it darker. We'll use a pretty big mountain knife. You just kind of want to do up and down zigzags in a few places, kind of vertical stripes almost. And this will just look like a general cliff shape. I'm also kind of bowing it, making it curve. You could use a smaller brush to put in a couple little cracks like that. And then we'll use the break thick brush to do a little bit of work with the paint break image hose. And we'll pick a secondary color here. We can use all kinds of different grays. So I'm going to use a lighter one first as my secondary color. And I'm going to paint. I want to try to get that nice paint break. I'm kind of just trying to throw this in a few different places here and there, mainly on the already lighter areas. And then on the darker areas, I'll throw in some. A lot of this is just going to get covered up by trees, so don't worry about putting too much detail in here. Use kind of a medium gray, just so there's some variety in the rock. And then right around here, I'll make it a little bit darker. And we'll have a patch, kind of an unusual patch here in the corner. You can also use the square chalk. That works really good for rock formations. You'll want to play around with some different paper settings. The polypay wool always works really good for rock. If you put these paper settings pretty high, you could throw in some of that for texture. And we could throw in a lighter area by sampling that. I keep forgetting to change my primary and my secondary color, so I'll have to make sure that I click here to change the color. I'm going to change your paper contrast and size occasionally too to get some different results with this brush. Now we'll blend this a little bit using the coarse oily blender and this same polypay wool paper texture. And this does a pretty good job of making this look like it was painted with a palette knife. It kind of streaks it and blends it at the same time, using short, quick little vertical drags, kind of light pressure. I'm following these contours of the cliffs. Try not to really pull from the outside of the cliff in, because if you do, you might get some white that you don't want. Now let's add some texture to the cliff. So let's do a select layer content of the cliffs layer. We'll turn off preserve transparency. We'll create a new layer. We'll make it a multiply composite method. We'll call it cliffs texture, and we'll hide the selection. We will use a dark gray for this, and we'll use the sponge. We want to turn down our paper texture and contrast a little bit so it doesn't affect our sponge. And we'll just paint over the whole thing. Use a small brush, and then I'll use a bigger brush. That way there's a variety of texture. And then you can turn down the opacity to find a nice blend. You don't want it to be too strong. Something like that looks really good. Now we can add some color by glazing. So we'll add a new layer and we'll call it Cliffs Color. That'll be a multiply composite method as well. Let's select one of these light blues from the sky, and we'll use the scratch board tool. And we're just going to paint over it with a big scratch board to turn all of this gray rock kind of this blue shade. And what that'll do is that'll help it match the environment. And then of course we will turn down the opacity a little bit as needed. I'm going to go down to about here because we're going to put some colors over this as well. Let's use the square chalk brush. We'll keep using this polypay wool texture and turn it up a little bit. And then I'm going to select some earth tone browns. like this. Just put in some brown patches here and there. Change my brown to another color, change the hue and put in more. You'll have to keep changing your paper contrast and size. Can add some gray back in. Some green is nice too. I kind of go more towards the yellow when I put in these greens, and it's going to be a bunch of moss kind of in this area here, so I'm just going to put in green for that. And then there's going to be a lighter patch of rock over here, so I'll put in some different colors for that. And then we'll blend this as we did before with the coarse oily blender. Turn these settings up here on the paper texture. I'm going to use that same kind of blending, just lightly blend it a little bit. Pull some of this down into the water. And then again, you can play with the layer opacity here and you can make it more or less vibrant. I think we want it probably to be right about there. I think that looks good. And then let's group these layers. So we'll take the cliffs layer, the cliffs text, and the cliffs. We'll group them into cliffs to keep things more organized. Now let's add some color to this pool of water here. We'll select the pool. We'll turn on preserve transparency. We'll select the scratch board tool. And this can just be a kind of blue-gray color. The water is moving so much that you're not really going to see any clear reflections. What you're going to see is just kind of a mixture of the environment colors, which is the sky, the brown from the cliffs, the green from the moss, and the green from the trees surrounding, which all kind of equals this greenish gray color here. So we'll put some of this in. I think we still have our cliffs selected, so we'll have to do Control D to deselect those cliffs. And now we can paint. That might be too bright of a green, so I'm going to make it more gray. Something like this is a good color. And we'll use the digital airbrush to add in some more detail. So we could sample some colors from the cliff, like this dark color, put in a little bit of that along that edge. We could sample the sky color and put some of that in the foreground ever so slightly. That's about all we need to do for this lake at this point. Next, let's tint the waterfall a little bit so it's not this white and gray color. We'll select the waterfall group and we will do select group content. We'll open the waterfall group and we'll create a topmost layer. We'll call it watercolor. And we'll turn off preserve transparency. We'll set the composite method to multiply. We will hide the selection. And we will sample the sky color and use the scratch board tool to just paint over the waterfall and all of the mist. And we will turn down the opacity until it's just tinting it a little bit. Then we can switch to the digital airbrush and select a warm color, something like this, and we'll paint over just the top area and have that fade down into the mist there. If you wanted to darken the mist a little bit too, you could with a more of a darker blue, something like that. And then you probably want to play with the opacity to where this is just a very subtle tinting of the waterfall. Let's go ahead and deselect that selection by doing Control D, and then we can start adding some distant plants and trees on our cliffs here. We'll go ahead and we'll start adding some moss. So I'm going to just close this waterfall group. I'm going to go to the cliffs layer and I'm going to add a new layer. I'll call it moss. And then we're going to use an image hose nozzle for this called dry sponge. That's this one here. And we will use the paint break brush. Switch to the secondary color and make that your moss color. And to make sure that we don't accidentally paint on our water or on our sky, what we'll do is we'll make a selection of the cliffs layer by doing select layer content. We'll just go back to the moss layer and start painting on it. We can also do hide marquee to hide that selection. And then we'll start painting in some moss. We want the moss to be heavier where it's closer to the water. You can kind of scrub with it, or you can do little light strokes. It's okay if you overpaint, because we can go through and we can mask some of it out so that it's not so heavy. Something like that looks good. Let's mask it a little bit. So we'll add a layer mask. We'll select black for our primary color, and we will use the square chalk brush and the polypay wool paper texture with these settings here. What that's going to do is when we paint now, we're going to get more of a fractal effect. So that's going to make the moss look like it's growing in distant patches. If you want to erase more of it, you can. You can turn down the contrast of the paper, and that'll remove more moss. You could also use the digital airbrush. That'll really get rid of it. I want it to kind of subtly blend in there. We can go out of the mask by clicking on the left icon here next to the mask, and we can use the square chalk brush to paint in some lighter colors on this moss in a few places. I'll just help it pop out. We could switch to some kind of yellow gold color there. And if you want to play with the layer opacity to blend in a little bit, you can. And then when we're finished with the moss, we can just apply this layer mask by right-clicking on it and choosing Apply Layer Mask. Now we want to darken this a little bit, because overall everything is going to be lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. So we're going to be doing that a lot. We want to select the layer content of the moss layer, create a new layer above it, make it a multiply composite method. We'll call it Moss Tint. We'll hide the selection. We'll select the digital airbrush and a dark blue-gray color for our main color. And lightly you want to paint over the bottom area of this moss and kind of the sides a little bit to draw the focus in towards the middle. Overall, you just want it to be a little bit darker on bottom so that it's not completely all the same value, otherwise it won't look right. And that's going to be the case for everything that we put on these cliffs. Now let's go ahead and group the moss layers together. Just call it moss. Let's add another layer of foliage. We'll create a new layer and we'll call it foliage. This could just be trees and plants, a bunch of distant green stuff. And we'll choose the dry dabs nozzle. That's this one here. We want to select our secondary color. We'll pick a nice green, something like this, starting out, and we'll want to use varied green shades. We want them to be brighter near the top and darker near the bottom. We'll select the paint break brush, and we'll use a slightly smaller brush, and we want to deselect our active selection by doing Control D, and now we can paint here. We want to do these little winding strokes to make trees here and there. You can use a bigger brush to put in some big clumps. You're really just kind of putting in little patches here and there, and don't worry about them looking absolutely perfect like trees, because that's not important. This is just going to be a layer of stuff. We'll put other layers on top of it that'll be more detailed, and those will look more like trees. It's important that you don't add too much detail here, because if you make things look too sharp, it's going to ruin that illusion of distance. I'm going to change the green to a different green, throw in some of that. It's going to be kind of quick and spontaneous about it, and just tap with this brush and put in stuff. Go brighter again, couple spots up there. I'm going to choose some darker greens to put in here near the bottom. You want there to be a lot of nice variety. Now let's add a layer of texture over this. So we will select layer content for the foliage, create a new multiply layer. We'll call it foliage texture. We'll hide the selection and we'll pick a dark green color for our primary color. And we will use the sponge. So we'll use a smaller sponge towards the top, paint over some texture. We'll make it bigger as we move towards the bottom. Now that really makes all those little blobs look like individual trees. You can turn down the layer opacity a little bit if you want to make it a more subtle blend. Let's add another layer for foliage tint. And this will be some areas where the trees are tinted. Maybe there's some dead leaves and things. So we'll take kind of an orange color like this. We'll make it a multiply composite method. And we'll use the sponge to just tap in a few places. We'll use a slightly brighter orange there, something like that. Gives it some variety. You can also use some greens if you want to kind of make the bottom a little bit darker in general. Now let's go ahead and save. So I'm going to do a save as because we're going to merge some layers. It's okay if this warning comes up, just go to OK. And we'll select all the foliage layers and we will merge them. Let's go ahead and just rename this to foliage now. We'll create a mask and we'll mask out some of this like we did with the moss. So we'll select black. We'll select the square chalk brush. Turn our paper settings up a little bit. And we'll go ahead and just paint over everything to break it up a little bit. Turn our paper contrast down so that we can really erase a lot of this. We're going to erase a bunch of it and then bring it back. And when you work forwards and backwards like this, it really makes it more random. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch to white now. We're going to change our paper scale and contrast a little bit and keep your scale kind of larger and your contrast kind of lower. And then just here and there, I'm just going to paint in and bring back some of these areas of plants and trees. Let's make a selection of the foliage layer. We'll create a new layer and we will call it Foliage Tint. We'll make it a multiply composite method and we're going to tint some of this. We'll hide the selection, and as before, we want the bottom trees to be darker than the top trees. So we're going to select the digital airbrush and a dark blue color like this, and we'll just paint over it to make the bottom edge slightly darker. If you need to, you can turn down the opacity a little bit to make it a more subtle blend. And then let's deselect our selection with Control D. Let's go ahead and just merge these two foliage layers together with Control E. And let's apply our layer mask to our foliage by right-clicking on it and doing Apply Layer Mask. And then we will duplicate that layer by right-clicking on it and choosing Duplicate Layer. We'll go to the bottommost layer and we will change it to Foliage Shadow. We'll set the composite method to multiply, and then we will select the black arrow tool and we'll just hit the down arrow key on the keyboard to scoot this down a little bit. What that's going to do is that's going to make it look like a shadow underneath all of these fractal shapes. So it really just kind of makes instant distant trees for you that way. If you need to play with the opacity, you can to make it blend in a little bit better. And we can soften the shadows a little bit using the blur blender. So I'm just going to paint over the whole tree area just a couple times to make sure that the shadows are blurry. And then you can keep adding more layers if you want to of foliage. So I'll add one more layer, call it Foliage Extra, and we will use the square chalk for that. Same polypay wool. Maybe this time we'll throw in a couple little spots of orange or something in here. It's okay if you overpaint because again we can mask it a little bit. Change the paper size and contrast a little bit. all these layers building up really helps to make this look realistic. So it's important to do this. You could just turn down the opacity a little bit to make that blend in. It's just a little subtle change here and there.